Good evening and welcome to the 34th annual MLK keynote address featuring Bree Newsome Bass. This past Monday was the 26th anniversary of the Federal American holiday and a day of service in honor of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. A civil rights pioneer, Dr. King's legacy forever altered the trajectory of United States history and inspired multiple generations to join together in the pursuit of equity and social justice. 2020 has showcased this in ways not seen since the civil rights movements. The events of 2020, COVID-19, marches and protests against systemic racism and blatant injustice, and a divisive election season has showed that we have yet to realize Dr. King's dream. His late daughter Yolanda once said, "We know the dream, all right, but some of us haven't realized the significance of it." Tonight, the Common Reading Program, the MLK Committee, and the entire Coog family are showcasing our togetherness and unity by coming together to celebrate Dr. King, not as an individual campus, but as an entire system. Each campus has played a part in funding and executing of this event and these programs. And while coronavirus restrictions and lockdowns have disrupted plans for many of our in-person celebrations and volunteering efforts, we're still here tonight to come together and to show our system-wide commitment to equity, inclusion, and social justice. We know that we have work to do to even come close to what Dr. King described as his beloved community, and not just in America, but on each of our respective campuses. We cannot and will not allow the events of 2020 to stay in 2020. We're walking into 2021 dedicated to dismantling systemic racism and blatant injustice. We won't go back to normal. We will work to create a better world. And in our effort to create this better world, tonight we're bringing in Bree Newsome Bass, and I will introduce Dr. Francisco Serratos from the WSU Tri-Cities campus who will be serving as this evening's host. Dr. Serratos was born in Mexico and has lived in the United States for the last 10 years. He is a scholarly assistant professor at the School of Languages, Cultures, and Race. His field of research is Latin American studies, the environment, and the history of capitalism. His most recent book is The Capitalist Scene, a radical history of climate crisis, published in Spanish by the University of Mexico. If we hope that you enjoy tonight, and we hope that you will please give your attention to Dr. Serratos. Francisco?
Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me. So welcome to this conversation. I am honored to have this conversation with Bree Newsome. I'm a big fan of hers. I always listen to all her interviews and tweets that I found on her account. And today we will discuss many topics that sometimes are not clearly understood. And Bree is going to help us to, give us her perspective on some of those topics. So Bree, welcome. Hello.
Hi. Hi.
It's such an honor to see you at least here. So Bree, we have a lot to discuss tonight, and I would like to start right away. Bree, before we start the actual conversation about your activism and career, I would like you to talk about a little bit about your life, where you grew up, your social background, education, where are you coming from, Bree?
Sure. So I was born in North Carolina, and that's where I am now, but I kind of took a journey before I got back down this way. So I actually grew up, I did all of my grade school in Columbia, Maryland, which is kind of an interesting place because it was like a planned community. So this is a place that was like developed in like the 70s. And the whole idea was to create like an inclusive kind of environment. So I actually grew up in like a really diverse area. We had mixed income housing. And my parents are both educators. When I was growing up, my mom in particular, her work really focused on disparities in education. So I kind of grew up with like, this awareness. And two, I think the thing that's important to understand is like, at no point in time when I was growing up, when I had ambitions of being an artist, that's what I ended up majoring in college. Did I say to myself, I'm going to be an activist? Or did I ever think about participating in actions, where I might risk getting arrested or anything like that? It's kind of more in retrospect, right? That like when I was looking over my life, I can kind of see how those things influenced me. And I think definitely seeing the work that my mom did. And so like growing up and being, aware, particularly of inequality in education. And just the fact that, kind of like where you lived or your income drastically determined, your access to education. And of course, my parents being teachers, their view strongly was that education was kind of like the key to advancement, and so that was kind of like their view on how we address inequality. So that had a profound impact on me. But it really wasn't until 2013. I mean, I got involved kind of at the same time that a lot of people, kind of got involved in what we would identify as the modern movement. And for me, it was both the combination of witnessing the Trayvon Martin case in particular and the attack on voting rights in North Carolina. So, the Supreme Court gutted pretty much the Voting Rights Act of 1965 in 2013. And North Carolina was one of those states that just started passing these bills, legislation that was just like so clearly designed to keep people from voting. And I think for me, it was very shocking to realize how quickly like those kinds of rights could be taken away. And, this is coming like in the middle of the Obama administration. So this is like, we had just gone through the election of the nation's first Black president. And there was all this discussion of, have we turned a corner as a nation? And in some ways it felt like maybe we had, but then to see this like really overt racist element just really emerge, which I mean, obviously we're still kind of witnessing that right now. It was the combination of those things for me that really kind of led me to a point of saying, okay, I am consciously going to devote, a lot of time and energy to this cause.
Okay, so you said you started in 2013 to get involved, in activism, but in 2015, June 2015, you did something incredible. You decided to go to the South Carolina Capitol that day to pull down the Confederate flag. And right after that, you were arrested. And so people have an idea what you accomplished that day. I would like to show the video so our students and the audience can see what you did, and then you can explain us what happened after that. All right. So I am going to play a video for you guys. I need to hear. Okay, I'm sorry for the issues in here, the technology and all this. So Alan, can you please...
Francisco, I could play it if you'd like.
Yes, can you please play it? Because it's a very short video, by the way. Okay. So.
Against
you saw now what she did. And my question is this. First, I would like to ask you about that flag, okay? Because many people, they don't really know the meaning of that flag today. And we know it was a symbol of for Southern slavers, Southern slave owners in the South. They hosted this more than a century ago, but sadly, it is still present in American culture. Bree, what does that flag mean for Black people nowadays?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, that flag, obviously, its origin is as the Confederate battle flag. You know, this and the Confederacy, of course, was formed specifically over the issue of slavery. And that's one of the kind of like ongoing historical erasures, part of what is still kind of at the center of the debate over how we, you know, remember history and tell the story of history in this country. But if you go back and you read, you know, the record, you see what people were saying at the time. It's very explicit. It's very clear that the Confederacy, they seceded from the Union for the whole purpose of preserving slavery. So that's the original, you know, kind of representation of the flag. And then, of course, after the Civil War, the flag continued to be used as a symbol of opposition, basically, to Black freedom and Black rights. And so that's why you will often see during protests during the Civil Rights Movement, for instance, you might see images of people marching, and then you will see racist segregationists, pro-segregationists standing on the side waving Confederate flags. In the case of South Carolina, they raised their particular flag, that one at the State House in the early 60s. And so you know, it has no historical connection to the Civil War. It was like explicitly a symbol of opposition to the Civil Rights Movement, because what was happening at that time, in particular, were the sit-in movements, which were led by students trying to desegregate. And one of the most famous sit-in protests was there in South Carolina. So that's kind of the history. And my family's from South Carolina. My mom's side of the family's from South Carolina. They were enslaved there. So we all grew up, you know, seeing that particular display there at the State House in South Carolina. And it was never a secret about what it represented. Some people who are, you know, are not from that region or maybe not familiar, they thought that it only became, you know, kind of a focal point in the aftermath of what happened in 2015 with the shooting at Emmanuel AME there in Charleston. But people have been protesting it for decades. In fact, in like the year 2000, they moved the flag from the dome of the Capitol to the lawn. And that's why it was on a flagpole on the lawn at the time that I took it down. But what they did at that time when they agreed to move it was they wrote a law that said the flag couldn't be lowered for any reason unless there was a 2/3 approval in the State House. And so that's how we ended up in this. Yeah, that's how we ended up in this situation where you had this horrific, you know, hate crime. This white supremacist went into a Black church and, you know, shot and killed 9 people. And when attention refocused on like, you know, well, why is the state displaying this flag? They were pointing to this law and saying, well, we can't lower it. And it just created this, you know, horrific image where they had lowered the United States flag to half-staff. Because one of the people who was killed there at the church, the pastor, was also a state senator, you know, so this was like an assassination of a politician. And so the United States flag had been lowered, but the Confederate flag was still at the top of the pole. So it's like symbolically, you know, the Confederacy is still flying above the United States flag. And so those were like the conditions that were kind of surrounding it. And so and I was working obviously with a team of people. You know, some people think I just like hopped up that morning and did it myself. It was planned, working with other people. But our whole goal with that was, you know, in that tradition of civil nonviolent disobedience, right? To draw a contrast between what is just and what is unjust. The violence that was on display in Charleston versus, you know, the peaceful demonstration. But really just like challenging South Carolina, like, why is there so much focus on a flag, right? As opposed to discussing what are the conditions that had led to the violence in Charleston, because the person who committed those crimes, Dylan Roof, he was in his early 20s. You know, this is not, we're not in 1965. I mean, this is 2015, and you're talking about somebody who was born in the 90s, you know, and just the fact that we were focused on a flag instead of like really having that honest conversation around what are the conditions that are still leading to these same circumstances.
Yeah. So my next question is about the same that same day. How do you feel after that? You were arrested.
Mhm.
Did you feel fear? Do you feel empowered? Do you feel like you accomplished something meaningful after that? What happened?
Yeah, I mean, my biggest struggle with fear was kind of in the lead up to, actually scaling the pole. Because obviously I knew it was, a physically dangerous thing to do. The thing that we were most concerned about, though, was just, potential violence from people who were down there because there was so much focus on the flag at that time. You had people protesting, on either side. So, there were like pro Confederate flag rallies going on down there as well. So that was really like, our greatest concern in terms of physical danger. I knew, there was a really obvious possibility, or it was pretty much certain that I would be arrested. So I was kind of prepared for that. And there was a point, right, actually, when I got ready to unhook the flag, that the police had tasers trained on me at one point. Like they were like going to threaten to electrocute me. But yeah, but once I came down, and I made it safely down, I just felt good because it was for me on a deeply personal level. It was an important statement to make. I'm descended from people who were enslaved in South Carolina. My grandmother grew up in segregated South Carolina. So these were things I grew up knowing about. It wasn't solely something that was in a history book. It was my family's history of experiencing the Ku Klux Klan. I had a great uncle who was lynched, so this was something that was very personal for me. And I wasn't sure exactly like, what the full impact of it would be. Once I got out, they held me in jail for a few hours, but once I got out, that's when I was able to see like how much of an impact it had had and that it was really reverberating. Because part of what we were showing was like, yes, you can take it down. Like this idea that, because of some law that was passed like, years ago, or because a decision that was made in the 60s to say that we can't do the right thing, in this moment didn't make any sense. And I think that was part of what was so impactful about it. And of course it helped, kind of expand this whole conversation around, particularly on state property, right? Like the display of Confederate monuments and symbols on government property.
Okay. Speaking of that, of state property, um, what do you think of the past Capitol riot, where many people carried the flag inside the Capitol for the first time in more than a century?
Yeah. I mean,
Why we should be worried about that?
that was it was a shocking sight, and at the same time it's not surprising, if that makes sense, right? So I remember sitting and watching those events unfold, and I think I even tweeted it. I was like, well, there goes the Confederate flag, like, like eventually it's going to pop up, like that is such a classic symbol of white supremacy, in this country, that it's not surprising, the day after we elect a Black man and a Jewish man to the Senate from Georgia, here's somebody is throwing up the Confederate flag. And I think it kind of like reflects a pattern in our history in this country, right, where we kind of like make this what seems like, a step forward towards progress, but then it's met with like this backlash, and I think it kind of reflects like the central conflict of the nation. And quite frankly, just the fact that we're still, talking about the display of monuments. Like here in North Carolina, we have a Confederate monument in front of virtually every county courthouse. It might be all of them. But I know for the most part, like if you go in front of any county courthouse in North Carolina, there's a monument to the Confederacy in front of the courthouse. And it says so much, about like the lingering legacy of Jim Crow down here. And I think the fact that here we had, the Confederate flag breach the Capitol, which I don't even think happened during the Civil War, just kind of points to the unresolved conflict.
Yeah. And what will you say to people that, are that we should respect those symbols because they're history? Therefore, they have to remain there. Like,
Yeah, again, like, and that's an argument people will often make. They're like, well, if we take it down, then we're erasing history. And I say no, like that's actually the opposite of what we're doing, because the monuments were placed there to erase history. Like the whole purpose, it was actually part of a deliberate campaign that took place like in the early 20th century. It's called the Lost Cause mythology, right? So they were trying to like rewrite the history of the Civil War. Basically, that's how we get the whole this whole argument that it was about states' rights. It wasn't really about slavery, or slavery really wasn't that bad, right? And what people like myself are advocating, we don't want to take down the monuments and the flags and then erase it and act like that history was never there. We have to talk about it. We have to educate around it, right? I mean, the swastika is also a historical symbol. There's a reason why, you know, it was important to take down all the Nazi memorabilia and then make sure that no one forgets, you know, that at one point this was everywhere, you know, because that's what's most dangerous in my view, is if we take it down and then act like it never happened.
Yes, exactly. And in recent years, the killing of Black people by the police have been all over the news. And those tragic events triggered a massive protest movement called Black Lives Matter. And I know it must be a little bit exhausting for people involved in the movement to explain over and over the meaning. But could you please tell our students what does Black Lives Matter mean, and your role in this movement?
Yeah, certainly. So, you know, I mentioned how I first got involved back in 2013 with the Trayvon Martin case. And, you know, Trayvon's case it really kind of echoes Emmett Till. If you're not familiar, Emmett Till, this was a lynching that happened in 1955. A young boy was lynched down in Mississippi. And it was really kind of like a catalyst for the civil rights movement of the 60s. Very similar thing kind of happened with Trayvon. And part of what was so what impacted so many of us at the time as young people was just like we saw ourselves in Trayvon, and just the way that it was basically like he was criminalized just for being Black. And just, I mean, it was basically like and for his killer to be acquitted, the basic justification was that just because Trayvon was Black and walking home and wearing a hoodie, that there was reason to fear him, and so therefore his murder was justified. And then what started happening, you know, 2013, we had a case in Charlotte, North Carolina, of police killing a young Black guy. He had crashed his car and went and knocked on a neighbor's door looking for help. And the police showed up and shot him like 14 times. And then 2014, we had Eric Garner and Mike Brown. And the basic through line in all of it was that somehow it's justified to kill people just because they're Black, right? People who are unarmed, people who are posing no threat. And so that's when Black Lives Matter really became the chant, you know, because it was like very clear that there's just this clear disregard for the lives of Black people. And even in taking the flag down, you know, again, it was like this other instance where we've had this horrific killing, racially motivated killing of 9 people. And instead of talking about the human cost, we're talking about a flag. We're talking about, you know, property and objects.
Worry about the flag. That's what matters, not the
exactly. You know, exactly. And it's so directly rooted in slavery and the fact that Black people were treated as property and counted as property, you know. And so culturally, even though we ended slavery, a lot of that ideology is still with us, you know. And so that's what the whole Black Lives Matter is like speaking to, that like we are human and we have to you know, it's just a call to humanity and to stop equating humanity with property.
Exactly. And what have you been involved in the movement? What have
yes.
you?
Yes. Yeah. So, I mean, you know, again, I think a lot of us would trace the origins of the modern movement back to 2013 in the Trayvon case, because that's kind of when you had like, and that's an interesting thing to really understand about movements too. Movements are so organic. It's never really like people say to themselves, we're going to start a movement, right? It's just like you have all these people kind of like responding in all these different ways. And so I was in North Carolina at the time. And I remember down in Florida, the Dream Defenders, they staged an occupation of the State House down there. I don't know if people remember that, but they like did a mass sit-in basically for several weeks. I went down there with some activists. And there was a point in time where we were just going from place to place around the country, because it was like every time you looked up, there was another incident of someone being killed. And I think the other thing that's really important to like understand, like, in terms of where this moment falls in history, right? Like, this is not a new issue, right? This is not a new issue at all. People have been talking about this for decades. I don't know if I'm probably dating myself. I'm not sure how old many of the students are, but in 1992 we had the Rodney King case. I don't know how many people who are watching were alive to witness that, but that was a major incident because that was kind of coming at the time where people first had like home video and where you actually witnessed police brutality like in that way, and that's why it was so explosive. And part of what started happening just in recent years was with everybody now having a camera phone, we were seeing just how often it was happening. And I think that was really what has kind of like shifted the ground and the conversation here in recent years. But we really, obviously with the George Floyd case, that was also a turning point because it's kind of like just in the past year, there has been more universal kind of mainstream acknowledgement, like, okay, no, this is very real, but in the earliest days and kind of like at the time that people started saying Black Lives Matter, the whole thing was just to don't look away. It was kind of like we really had to force people to come into the recognition that this is a very real thing. And you have a lot of cops who are killing people and it's completely unjustified and there's no accountability for it, and that's the central problem.
Yeah, and I like that this thing that you mentioned, that it was organic, how it happened, right? And what would you say to people that think or say that that is not the right way to protest, right? Like when people go outside in the streets protest, and sometimes there's some looting, they said that's not the right way. But on the other hand, when other people such as this football player, I forgot his name.
Kaepernick.
Yes, takes a knee, that's not right either. So what would you say about it? Is that a right way to protest, or what?
I would say there's never a right way to protest for people who don't want to hear the protest, right? And that's an important thing to understand. A lot of times people say, oh, well, you got to protest in the right way, you've got to protest peacefully. But then you see, and see that's part of, that is part of the strategic power of nonviolent civil disobedience, and the way that Martin Luther King used it and the way that Gandhi used it, because you show the hypocrisy of it, right? Because if you were truly concerned about the issue, right, and you were okay with peaceful protest, then a genuinely peaceful protest would not invite the violent response. And I think that's why, Colin Kaepernick taking a knee was such an exposing moment, because I mean, what is he doing? He's just simply kneeling during the national anthem, and look at the response. If you agree that, police violence is bad and, we support peaceful protest, then you would support that, right? And then the other thing that happens is like with the rioting and looting that gets lost in that is people reach a breaking point. Again, Martin Luther King Jr., he was the one that said riots are the language of the unheard. Because when you have people who are protesting and organizing and petitioning and, trying to work through the system, and the system continues to be unjust, eventually people reach a breaking point. And I think the important thing to understand about situations like Ferguson and Baltimore, or my hometown in Charlotte, is that those incidents where you see people like, rioting and stuff, it's a long time building to that. That doesn't just happen overnight. It's kind of like you have a community that has been on edge for a long time, has felt like the local leadership is not, responding to them. And then you have it's usually 9 times out of 10, it's a case of police violence, police kill someone. And that's kind of what sets off the rioting that occurs. And then, of course, police escalate the violence in the way that they respond. And the last thing I want to say to that is, I think what happened in the past 2 weeks with this riot on the Capitol was it showed exactly the truth of that dynamic, because in that case, the police chose not to escalate, right? They were very...
Actually, some of police, we saw that some actually joined.
Exactly. They were very controlled, if they weren't outright participating in the riot, so it shows that they have control over their actions. They're choosing when to really escalate and be violent and when not to.
Yes, exactly. Let's talk about the police, by the way. recently you tweeted something very interesting about the correlation between white supremacy and fascism. Could you please elaborate on the role of the police in this idea?
Yeah, absolutely. So, fascism is like a very specific political movement and phenomenon that we can kind of like trace like the 20th century, figures like Mussolini and Hitler, and Francisco Franco. And it kind of centers around like a strongman leader. They tend to be demagogues, right? They tend to emerge from situations where people are experiencing like, a lot of economic strife. There's strong nationalism, and they give people kind of like an easy solution, right? The easy solution is it's those people's fault. And I'm the strong person who can solve it. So that's kind of what fascism is. And of course, like a very strict authoritarian government. But where it overlaps with white supremacy, which, predates fascism by centuries, right? Is just the inherent racist nature of fascism. So not all white supremacy is fascism, but pretty much all fascism is going to be white supremacy, right? Like that's basically the dynamic. And fascism and white supremacy, because they're so big on like authoritarianism, it's very much like this rigid kind of militarism, policing, the idea of like policing the communities that are targeted, right? And so that's why you saw, for instance, with like Trump's version of fascism, this obsession with policing and military, and Trump would play into. Exactly. And Trump would play into that a lot. Oh, I'm the biggest friend of the military and the police. And of course, in the United States, right, policing and white supremacy are like this and always have been. I mean, going back to the slave patrols, which were some of the earliest forms of policing. And we have a long history in this country as well of there being collaboration between police and white supremacist groups. Either police officers are actually members of the Ku Klux Klan, or they assist the Ku Klux Klan or are sympathetic to the Ku Klux Klan, right? And so again, it's like when we get to an event like we saw a couple weeks ago, and everybody's like, "Oh my goodness, there are police officers, who are involved." It's like, well, yeah, again, like we have to stop being in denial about this, because it's so baked into the institution. And that's why, again, with the movement, part of what we're trying to push people on is it's not just about bad apples, right? It's not just about a personnel thing. It's a cultural thing. It's an institutional.
And it's structural.
It's structural, right? And that's what's so important to understand.
Yeah, that it's not about pointing fingers at him or her. It's the institution, right?
Exactly. And if it weren't, then we wouldn't see the same problem at like almost every police almost every police force across the country, right? We might say, oh, this one police force has a real issue, right? But the fact that you see it and it's so systemic points to the structural nature of it.
Yes. Now, the next question actually it's about one of the proposals, that came out of the Black Lives Matter movement, and it has to do with defunding the police. Many people, when they hear that phrase, defund the police, they think or tend to think that what the protesters are demanding is that no more justice, like crime is just going to be rampant, etc. But I feel like it goes deeper than that. Can you please explain us what does defund the police mean?
Yes. So it means two things at once, right? One is addressing the enormous amount of resources that are devoted to policing, which is a problem, because policing, we see that funding policing is not addressing crime. So a lot of times people, they do think they have this assumption that if you're talking about defunding policing, then you're saying you don't want to address crime. And no, that it's the actual opposite. What we're saying is that we have issues of violence in our community. We have issues of, poverty, and how can we address this in ways that are more effective than simply pouring more money into police? Because not only is policing not addressing these issues, but it's adding to the issues. I mean, again, if you think about it in terms of like the civil unrest that we have had in this country in the past few years, it all ties back in most cases to issues with the police, right? So the police are more of a source of a problem than a solution to it. So the idea is, well, let's look at the budget. Like where are we putting the money, and how could we, instead of putting millions and millions and millions of dollars into policing, put money into other resources, right?
Such as
If we
what?
were to
Can you give us examples? Such as what?
Absolutely. Like if we were to fund housing, right?
Mhm.
If we were to fund social programs, let's imagine, if people are involved in a domestic dispute, that's one of the most common things that has the police call out. Instead of sending a police officer out with a gun, we send a social worker. We send somebody who's actually trained on how to deal with those kinds of conflicts. The other major thing that's often overlooked is a lot of these cases where people are being harmed by police. These are people with disabilities and people with mental health issues, right? So, but the people that we're sending out, the police are not trained to deal with mental health crises, right? So what if we were to fund something like that instead? So it's both like it's not just defunding, it's about changing how we resource things. Yeah.
Exactly. Like divest the fundings towards other public
Exactly.
institutions that can help people with drug addiction. Instead of going to jail, maybe you should go, to rehab.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay, so my next question is a big part of your activism focuses on economic inequality, voting rights, housing rights, etc. Could you please talk about how these topics are correlated to racism? How Black people or people of color are impacted by those inequality issues?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, first of all, poverty is an issue across the board, right?
Mm.
But it disproportionately impacts Black people because of racism, because of structural racism. We're still really, in a lot of ways, we're dealing with the residual impact of policy from the early 20th century. So, obviously, we're dealing with a major economic crisis now, with the pandemic, probably the greatest one since the Great Depression. Well, back during the Great Depression, when they were trying to figure out how to, address that, they instituted a lot of economic policies. That's when they created the suburbs. That's when they did like the GI Bill. But a lot of those things only went to white people, and Black people were cut out of that. And so here we are, like generations later, and we have this enormous wealth gap that exists that's tied to race. And so we have to have policies that address both economic inequality and racial inequality as well, because those things go hand in hand. And what you're going to find is that when you're talking about housing issues or healthcare disparities or education disparities, it's Black and brown people who are disproportionately impacted by it. It's not that it's only Black and brown people, but Black and brown people disproportionately.
Mm-hmm. And there's my next question. This was supposed to be the last one, but we can continue if you would like to. Is after all of this that we have discussed, we're dealing with very big issues here. Why do you think it is important for everyone, especially young people, to get involved in protests against racism and white supremacy?
Yeah, I mean, quite frankly, it is killing us. I mean, it is literally killing all of us. And I think that if it wasn't clear before, I really think that the pandemic era has made that clear, right? Because the pandemic has shown that like the overall health of the nation is impacted by who has access to healthcare. If a large amount of people, whether it's the essential workers, it's low income workers, if they don't have access to healthcare, that's a major part of why the outbreak here is so bad. And so, I think a lot of times in our culture here, we think very individualistically, right? Like, well, if I'm doing okay, then how does it really, impact me? But it does. It impacts the overall quality of life, and so I think I'm hoping that in this generation in particular, people are kind of coming to recognize that more, that we really have to look at what is the quality of life in our whole nation, and that it does matter how things impact people, even if you're not Black, or even if you're Black and you're not poor, right? Like these issues do impact all of us. And structural racism is a major part of what's holding us back. We've even had major cities now declare racism to be a public health crisis, because that's how linked structural racism is to the health outcomes of people in this country.
Bree, now that we have a new administration, and that you talk that you like how young people are, getting more and more involved in this and being aware of the racial issues. Are you hopeful?
I am. I'm cautiously hopeful. I think that again in this country, there's kind of like a pattern of 2 steps forward or 1 step back or whatever. But I am hopeful. I think that I think that it's possible we have reached a turning point. And I certainly hope that it's been a moment of awakening for a lot of people.
That's good to know. So I think it's moment to move on to the questions from our students, and I have a couple of questions here. The first question is from Dr. Paul Pitre. Sorry if I'm not pronouncing your last name correctly. How would you Bree, this question is for you. How would you describe the reaction of the Confederate flag supporters after you took down the flag? That's what,
Yeah, I mean, again, it really exposed where people stood, because you had a lot of people who were more upset about the Confederate flag than the horrific murders that had happened in Charleston, and I think that says a lot. I went down to speak in Charleston at one point, like I think it was 2 years after the fact, and there was a group, they flew Confederate flags all over the city, so there definitely was some backlash, but I do feel like overall since that time, we've done a good job in terms of making it very clear that it's a hate symbol.
Oh, okay, good. The next question is from Raymond Sun, and he says, I noticed that on the video of you taking down the Confederate flag, you said that you were doing it in the name of Jesus. Could you talk about the intersection of faith and anti-racism activism, either for you personally or more generally?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so I am a person of deep faith. As a Christian, it does inform my activism because, I really do believe in anti-oppression, and I really do believe in human equality, and the philosophy of love as taught by Jesus. So that kind of just informs how I show up, right? But it also definitely comes in a tradition of overlap between the abolitionist movement and Christian churches. Of course, we know Christianity has played a major role in the slave trade and oppression, and being on the other side of it. But there's also been a long tradition of the church being involved in abolition and anti-racism work in the country.
Yes. The next question is from Ella Peterson, and she says, I am a history education major, and part of the reason why I wanted to become a teacher is because I feel like teachers can really sugarcoat history, especially the history of Black people in America. Is there anything specifically that you feel like should be addressed more clearly in the classroom? Or maybe something that it isn't addressed in general that you wish to be addressed?
Oh goodness, yes. And I mean, of course I'm biased because my parents are teachers, but I really do think that teachers are some of like the most influential people. Like I never forget experiences I had with teachers. But this whole issue of slavery, I mean, it's a 400-year, history that is largely glossed over or not taught at all, or mistaught. And I think a lot of times we underestimate how much that lack of education or deliberate miseducation around the history of slavery has contributed to the problems that we have today. So I think there's a lot of work to be done around how are we educating around the history of slavery.
Yeah, I think, or I believe that teaching is activism. Do you agree?
I completely agree. I completely agree. And one of the things I constantly say to people is like, a lot of times there's this like narrow idea of what activism is. But the classroom is one of the front lines. I mean, absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I always engage my students in very, controversial topics with fear. Like, oh my God, should I say that? Maybe I should not give them that reading. But actually, it's quite the opposite. Like, sometimes I think we, underestimate their curiosity. Yeah, I think teaching is a good moment to, dismantle many prejudices that we have. I'm waiting for the next question, so that's why.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah, to dismantle a lot of prejudices that students hear in, in the news, or maybe the neighbor say something, and they don't know because they don't have the resources or the tools to investigate what really happened in that.
Yeah.
No. So we have another question, but where is it? Wait, I'm waiting for them to share them with me. Alan, which one are we going to? Okay, so here's another one from oh my god, Xian Nader. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Now that we have an administration that is opening talking about systemic racism, what do you think the next directions of this movement for full liberation must be? And how do we work to hold our elected officials accountable to racial equality? That's a good question.
Yeah, that's excellent. I think it comes down to dismantling structural racism as a matter of policy. Obviously, this defund the police question is a major lightning rod, right? And so even with this administration where they are openly talking about systemic racism, there's a lot of pushback against that. But there's a reason why organizers like myself feel like that is one of the most essential things to address, because in terms of how we experience racism, it is largely police on a daily basis that are enforcing the color line, right, and these racist policies. And I also organize around housing. One of the major reasons we can't get funding for housing again is because of where the budget priorities are. So I think we have to really look at policy, and I think we have to be unrelenting in it. Politicians are going to be set in their ways, and doing things and listening to the same kind of forces that tend to be powerful. But we have to really organize ourselves as people and really demand the things that we know that we need.
Yeah, organizing is important, I think, all the time, because I feel many people feel like democracy is, like a state of comfort. But in reality, it's constant struggle.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so we have another question for you, Bree, from Tiffany Pricey. Does performative activism for white allies do more harm than good?
Does activism from white allies do more harm than good?
Yes.
It depends. I mean, and how if you're talking about white allies who are truly about dismantling white supremacy, then no, that's excellent. I think where it becomes problematic is when you have white allies who are not really willing to take the lead from Black organizers, right? Sometimes, whiteness it's a social practice. It's a construct. It's a habit of behavior in a lot of ways that we're socialized into. And so you have to be willing to be self-aware of that, and be willing to dismantle it.
Okay, good. We have more questions, Alan, in here. They said that we have more, but it's taking time to receive the. Ask about performative allies. Maybe correct the questions. Okay, so does performative activism from white did I miss that part? Bree? I think I didn't know.
You said
I'm gonna repeat
performative.
the question. Does performative activism from white allies do more harm than good?
Oh yes, performative. Yes, absolutely. I mean,
Did I miss that? I'm sorry if I did. Sorry.
Yeah. No, that's a less nuanced. Yeah, no, because it's performative. It's not. I mean, one of the nearest things is, of course, now everybody's Black Lives Matter and Black squares on social media, and all this like surface level performance. But then again, when we start talking about like policy and actually changing things, you get the pushback, and that's kind of what I would describe as performative. Yeah.
Oh, okay. We have another one from Christine Cuddy. When racial injustice occurs, we often see a surge of people speaking out and or taking action. Unfortunately, that response is often not sustained, which hinders long-term change. How do you encourage others to commit to sustainable rhythms of activism incorporated into one's life, this is a very long question, incorporating to one's lifestyle versus momentary or one-time action?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question. That is part of the challenge of organizing. I will say in a very practical way though, like as a grassroots community organizer, you have to recognize people are going to come and go. Things are going to ebb and flow, right? So we go through a period of time where there may be a flashpoint, a case everybody's talking about it, and it's, you know, the energy's up here and everybody wants to do something, and then it kind of dies down a little bit. But the important thing is like when everybody's up, and that's when we try to bring as many people in as possible. We try to educate people as much as possible, get people involved. But the key thing is to keep organizing no matter what, because that next time of heightened energy is always going to come. Again, you've got to remember what we just witnessed with like George Floyd, right? That came 7 years after Trayvon Martin, right? So it was like 7 years from like the start of Black Lives Matter to this like really huge flashpoint with George Floyd. But we never would have gotten there if people hadn't kind of sustained on some level the energy, you know? So I think sometimes people think it's always going to be up here, and it just simply isn't. And that's okay. It doesn't mean that you're not still moving people.
And Bree, how will you encourage young people to go outside and engage in some sort of activism? Because sometimes they feel like, I want to be part of that, but I don't know how. Like, what steps should they take?
I really think connecting with organization is so key. It's so important. And when we talk about organize that you have to organize, you have to build organized power. You have to. That's the only way that you can make things change. So I would really encourage you, like, if you want to get involved, like think about, is there an issue that you're really passionate about? Is there an organization that you can, you know, connect to? And I would say, like, use that as a starting point. There's an endless list of issues, right? But there's got to be something that, you know, maybe more than anything else is really close to your heart or your experience or important to you. And so I would suggest starting there.
Okay, good. We have another question from Samantha Edgestrom. Can there ever be significant change throughout the US without a complete reformation and reconstructing of law enforcement and the prison system?
No, I don't think that I don't think that it can. I don't think that it can, because in this country, the prison system and the legal system, well, first of all, the legal system has always been structured around structural racism. But the prison system in particular, after slavery, kind of became like the new form of racial control. So no, I don't think there's a way without addressing that.
Yes. Do we have more questions, guys? It seems that we have some more. We're just waiting. So we have a couple of questions about text. From Carrie. What is her take on the unity talk by our president? And this is actually a good question, because recently you tweeted that we should not go back to normalcy.
Yeah.
Elaborate on it.
I'm very wary of the talk about unity and normalcy. Like it's a very convenient kind of political talking point, but what does that mean? Like, what are we unifying around, right? Like, you know, again, I think we're facing like the greatest conflict this nation has seen since the Civil War. There was a reason you can't just unify the Confederacy and the Union without abolishing slavery. And I think we're at a point now, we can't just unify with white supremacists and people who are in favor of multiracial democracy. One or the other has to go. Like if we're going to unify, we have to unify around this idea that everybody is entitled to citizenship, right? Everybody is entitled to human rights, and that's it. It's not up for debate. And then in terms of like returning to normalcy, that to me is a dangerous line, right? Because and it kind of plays into this idea that Trump came out of nowhere. You know, we see this a lot, like we don't know where Trump came from, and he just disrupted everything, and now he's on a plane to Florida, and now we're just back to normal, which is really dangerous, because that kind of thinking leads us away from really analyzing what we just went through. He didn't come from nowhere. You know, there's a reason why he was able to rise to power in the way that he did. And if we don't address it, we will absolutely repeat that same thing that we just went through.
Yes, exactly. Do we have more, guys? More questions? From Cassandra Vogel, she says, how do you distinguish which activism is performative versus one that is not?
Yeah, to me, I define performative as very like surface level.
Mhm.
A lot of times, because especially like recently, this is like a new phenomenon. It's like cool to be an activist, which is not all bad, but it's like it's kind of like this weird thing where it's like a status symbol. Celebrities are very now into showing us that they are, engaged in some kind of activism. But the question to me, what separates performative from substantive is like, what is the actual substance? What's actually being changed by what we're doing? To me, performative is like I'm wearing a t-shirt,
Mhm.
I'm flying a flag, okay, but
Yeah.
how is it really translating to change?
Yes. We have one more from Lindsay. She says, what books or, oh, this is a good one actually. What books or authors do you recommend for us to check out and learn social justice topics?
Oh gosh, that's a great question. Honestly, Pedagogy of the Oppressed popped into my mind just because of the conversation we had about teaching and education. That's a really powerful text to read. Let's see, From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation by Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor is really good. If you're trying to like understand some of the history of like this modern movement. And then of course, the New Jim Crow is like a really important text in understanding the relationship between prison system and voting disenfranchisement and racism. Those are three that pop top of my. Oh, another one I would really recommend is The Half Has Never Been Told. I was talking about how like the teaching of slavery is really kind of glossed over. That's a really powerful text and really making it clear just how fundamental slavery was to the expansion of the United States. Yeah.
Good. We have a couple more. It says, this is the final question from Blythe. Given the history of systemic racism in this country and the recent events at the Capitol, what gives you hope?
Well, yeah, I mean, my main source of hope, right, is the fact that I know things change. Like I know it's possible because we've seen it, like we're living it. Like there was a time when the idea of a United States without chattel slavery was like inconceivable. I mean, it was like, and as much as we celebrate these figures now, like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. I mean, at the time they were considered very radical. Like the idea that, we should end slavery and have equality, that was a very radical thing to say at the time. And of course, now it's like, oh, of course, that's mainstream. That's mainstream American values, right? And so for that reason, like I think that standing in your principles and fighting for a better future is very crucial because things can change. Martin Luther King Jr. I mean, everybody claims to love him now. Martin Luther King Jr. was not a popular figure. That's like a lot of historical revisionism. He was really not a popular figure at the time because of the way that he was challenging things. But look at how, even though there's still obviously racism, there is at least this kind of like mainstream embracing of the idea that he was right in terms of what he was saying, right? And so that's kind of what gives me hope that if we press on, things will improve and change. Yeah.
No? Okay. So that was our last question, Bree. And I would like to thank you for this conversation. I really enjoyed it. I learned a lot from you, and I'm pretty sure the students did as well. And lastly, we would like to hear some words from another host, that is Karen. Are you there, Karen?
Yeah, thank you so much, both Francisco and Bree, for such a great conversation tonight. On behalf of Alan, who you met at the front end of the program, who directs the MLK program, and me, I'm with the Common Reading program. We really want to thank both of you and also our attendees for spending this hour with us tonight. We also want to thank the many sponsors across the whole WSU system who made this event possible. We hope that you'll join us for our next two keynote speakers in the MLK Common Reading Series. We have Dr. Anthony Jack coming on February 9th and Ijeoma Oluo on March 29th. So we hope you'll join us for that. You'll notice if you are a student who's attending for Common Reading credit, there's a link now in the chat that you should visit to enter your name and ID number. And that information will then be entered into Presence, which is the system that will verify your attendance this evening. But I just especially want to thank again Francisco and Bree for such a great conversation that I think provoked lots of interesting questions and is a great start to our continuing series of thinking about these issues in a thoughtful and sort of nuanced way. So thank you so much. Thank you for our attendees for joining us. We wish you well this semester, and we're delighted to have you with us this evening. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm a big fan.
Absolute
Bye.
pleasure. Thank you.